In the heart of an unassuming neighborhood, nestled between a quaint antique shop and a cozy little cafe, stood the old Victorian house at 427 Elm Street. The once grand residence had fallen into disrepair over the years, but it still possessed an undeniable charm that drew Emily Thompson to rent its second-floor apartment. The air was heavy with the scent of rain as Emily wrestled her last box up the creaking staircase. She paused on the landing, catching her breath and wiping sweat from her brow, despite the October chill. The house felt alive, in a way she couldn't quite explain. But then again, old houses often had personalities of their own. As she stepped into her new home, Emily felt a sense of relief. After months of cramped living with friends post-graduation, this place was practically palatial by comparison. She set down the box and looked around, taking in the high ceilings, wide plank hardwood floors, and intricate moldings that hinted at the house's former glory. Over the next few hours, Emily unpacked her belongings, arranging furniture to fit the space just so. As she worked, she began to notice a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere above. It reminded her of rain against a window, but there were no windows in this room. She shrugged it off as old pipes doing their thing and continued about her task. Once her things were unpacked, Emily took a moment to appreciate the quiet. Well, almost quiet. There was that tapping sound again, steady, unrelenting. She grabbed a flashlight from her kitchen drawer and followed the noise down the narrow hallway towards the bedroom. As she approached the closed door, the tapping seemed to grow louder, more insistent. She reached for the knob, her heart suddenly pounding in her ears. Just old pipes, she reminded herself, pushing open the door. The room was dark, the single window covered by heavy drapes. Emily swept her flashlight beam across the ceiling, searching for any signs of water damage or leaks that might explain the noise, but found nothing. She moved onto the walls, her eyes catching on something peculiar as she panned back towards the door. There were small holes punctured into the wall near the floorboard, dozens of them arranged in neat little rows. They looked almost like vents. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The tapping was coming from inside the walls. She pressed her ear against the cold plaster, listening intently. And then she heard it. Not just the tapping, but something else too. A low, barely there whisper, carried on the faint breeze escaping through the vents. Emily, her name, whispered like a ghostly caress, sent shivers racing down her spine. She stepped back, eyes wide with shock and disbelief. It had to be her imagination playing tricks. There was no such thing as ghosts. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over her. As she left the room, closing the door firmly behind her, the tapping continued, accompanied now by whispers only she could hear. The next morning, Emily woke with a start, her heart racing as if jolted awake by some unseen force. She listened intently but heard nothing out of the ordinary. No tapping, no whispers, just the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chirp of a bird outside. She shook off the lingering unease and made herself breakfast, determined to enjoy her first full day in her new home. As she ate, she noticed a small white envelope tucked into the doorframe of the back entrance. She opened it to find an invitation from her downstairs neighbors, the Millers, a sweet elderly couple who seemed eager to welcome her to the house. "Mrs. Miller said you're new here," Mr. Miller had written in neat looping handwriting. "Come by for tea sometime, dear. We'd love to meet you properly." Emily smiled, grateful for their kindness. She finished her breakfast and decided it was as good a time as any to visit them. The Millers' apartment was much like theirs. High ceilings, creaking floorboards, and an air of history that seemed to cling to every corner. Mrs. Miller greeted Emily warmly at the door, ushering her inside with a soft, "Come in, dear. Isn't it lovely weather we're having?" Mr. Miller looked up from his armchair as they entered the sitting room, nodding pleasantly. "Welcome, welcome, my dear," he said, pushing his glasses up onto his nose. "We've been hoping to meet you." Emily sat down on the sofa opposite them, accepting a cup of tea from Mrs. Miller. As they chatted, she couldn't help but notice how oddly alike the Millers seemed. Their mannerisms, their speech patterns, even their facial expressions were almost identical. "Have you noticed anything unusual about this house?" Emily asked after some time, trying to sound casual despite her racing heart. The Millers exchanged a glance, something unspoken passing between them. Then, they both turned to face Emily, their smiles fading. "It's an old house," Mr. Miller said slowly, "with its own quirks and eccentricities." "Like what?" Emily pressed, leaning forward in her seat. Mrs. Miller looked down at her hands, folding them neatly in her lap. "We've heard things over the years. Strange noises, whispers." She trailed off, shaking her head slightly as if to dispel some unpleasant thought. Emily's blood ran cold. She opened her mouth to ask more, but was interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. "Expecting someone?" Mr. Miller asked his wife, standing up to answer it. Mrs. Miller shook her head, frowning. "No, we're not." As he opened the door, a man stepped inside, tall, thin, with sharp features and an intense gaze that seemed to fix on Emily like a predator locking onto its prey. "Ah," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You must be the new tenant upstairs." Emily nodded wordlessly, suddenly feeling very small under his piercing stare. This was Henry, their landlord. A man they'd heard more about than seen since signing their lease. "I trust everything's in order?" he asked, though it sounded more like an accusation than a genuine question. "Yes," Emily managed to reply. "The apartment is lovely." Henry's gaze flicked briefly towards the Millers before settling back on her. "Good," he said, his lips curling into a faint, unsettling smile. "Then I won't keep you any longer." With that, he turned and left as abruptly as he'd arrived. The room seemed to exhale in relief once the door clicked shut behind him. Emily looked at the Millers, questions bubbling up inside her. Who was Henry? What did they know about this house? But before she could voice any of them, Mrs. Miller stood up suddenly, gathering their empty teacups. "We should be going too, dear," she said, her earlier warmth replaced by a stiff formality. "It's been so nice meeting you." As Emily made her way back upstairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong in this house, and not just within its walls. That night, Emily found herself unable to sleep. Every creak of the old floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside her window made her jump, her mind racing with thoughts of the tapping and whispering she'd heard before. She sat up in bed, listening intently, and then, there it was. That steady rhythm again, accompanied by a faint, barely discernible murmur. She swung her legs out from under the covers and grabbed her flashlight, heart pounding as she made her way towards the bedroom door. The noise seemed louder tonight, more insistent somehow. It seemed to beckon her, drawing her closer with each step. She reached out a trembling hand, pushing open the bedroom door. As she stepped inside, the whispers grew clearer, louder, like a chorus of voices whispering her name over and over again. "Emily, Emily." She swept her flashlight beam across the walls, searching for the source of the sound. And then she saw it. A small hidden doorway tucked away behind an old wardrobe. Her breath caught in her throat as she approached, reaching out tentative fingers to trace the outline of the doorframe. It was almost invisible, cleverly concealed within the wall itself. She pushed gently against the wood, and it creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. This was ridiculous. She shouldn't be investigating strange noises in the middle of the night. She should be calling the police, or at least telling someone where she was going. But instead, she found herself descending those stairs, drawn forward by an irresistible force. The air grew colder as she went deeper underground, the whispers echoing around her like a ghostly symphony. She reached the bottom of the staircase and stepped into a small, dimly lit room filled with old furniture and yellowed photographs. As she moved further inside, the tapping stopped abruptly. leaving only the hushed murmurs of her name filling the silence. She turned around slowly, flashlight sweeping across the walls lined with more hidden vents, dozens of them, like tiny mouths gasping for air. And then she saw it, a single word carved into the plaster above one of the vents. Emily. Panic surged through her veins as she realized the truth. This wasn't just some old house with strange quirks. This was something else entirely. Something dark and twisted and terrifyingly real. She turned to run, but it was too late. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her inside. Emily threw herself against the door with all her might, but it didn't budge. She was trapped. The realization sent a wave of terror crashing over her as she turned back to face the room, her flashlight beam trembling in her hand. The whispers grew louder now, more urgent. A cacophony of voices whispering her name, pleading, demanding. She pressed her hands against her ears, trying to block out their haunting chorus, but it was no use. The sound seemed to come from inside her very skull. As she stood there, paralyzed by fear, the walls began to change. The once smooth plaster started to ripple and warp like a funhouse mirror, revealing glimpses of faces hidden within. Pale, twisted visages with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through her. Emily stumbled back, horror-struck, as she recognized one of those faces. It was Mrs. Miller, or rather a distorted version of her, contorted by pain and fear. And there, next to her, was Mr. Miller, too, his mouth open wide in a silent scream. Realization dawned on Emily like a punch to the gut. The Millers weren't just odd. They were trapped here, just like she was, trapped by Henry. Her mind flashed back to the landlord's intense gaze, his unsettling smile, and suddenly, everything made sense. He'd done this, somehow. He'd sealed them all inside these walls, condemning them to an eternity of torment. With newfound determination, Emily lunged at the door again, throwing her weight against it with a desperate cry. This time, something gave way, an old bolt sliding back with a loud clack. The door swung open, revealing the dark staircase beyond. She didn't look back as she fled up those stairs, the whispers echoing behind her like a dying breath. As she reached the top and stumbled into the safety of her bedroom, she knew one thing for certain. She had to leave this house, now. But even as she packed her bags, grabbing only the essentials, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, waiting for her. As Emily stepped out onto the street, pulling her front door closed behind her, she took one last look back at 427 Elm Street, and there, in the second-floor window, she thought she saw a face, pale and twisted, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow her as she walked away. She never looked back again,